living a full and well life is to put together, grow, authentic.
We feel it.
Take care of ourselves.
Hello, and welcome back to the Wishing You Well podcast, where we help you navigate your wellness journey each and every week. I'm Amy Albero.
And I'm Catherine Van Eyck. We're both licensed therapists and simplifying all things wellness for you here on Wishing You Well. And today might be a little bit different. We talk a lot about the various avenues of improving your health, and not that those topics aren't serious, but we often find ourselves laughing a lot and keeping things light. This episode, we welcome a special guest and fellow Revive therapist, Arielle Kempler, to discuss trauma. So that's why we might not be joking around as we typically do.
Mm-hmm.
It might get a little more serious.
Yeah. And you know, trauma is such an important topic and meaningful thing for us to discuss. We actually are going to do a 2-part episode with Arielle, and even that will just barely scratch the surface. But also want to encourage you all, as you're listening, to pay attention to what thoughts and feelings come up for you, what reactions come up for you as we are going through our discussion today. And we'll be sure to put some resources in the show notes as well. So we're going to get into it, our kind of like trauma part 1 episode. But before we do, speaking of checking in with ourselves, we are still going to start this episode with a check-in about how we're doing, what self-care is looking like. And Arielle, we just want to welcome you and thank you for being here. And with that, can you share a little bit about, how you are, what self-care looks like for you this week?
Well, thank you both for having me. I'm really excited to be here, which I feel like may be a interesting thing to say considering I'm talking about trauma. But I hope that I can impart some wisdom or at least some information and I love being able to talk about something I'm passionate about and passionate helping people with. But in terms of self-care, I am getting over being sick. So what I've really been embracing is the little things that I've been doing to take care of myself. Because, I can't do these like big things, and also being like a working mom, it's been really hard to do the big things that I want to do for self-care. I have adjusted my morning schedule by 15 minutes and it has changed my life. I, instead of snoozing for 15 minutes more, I've just been waking up when my alarm goes off, which it sounds so simple. But what I find is that then I have more time in the morning to do to get ready and to not rush, so that when it's time for me to get out the door, I'm not a crazy woman, like having a million things in my hands and like putting on my eyeliner as I'm leaving. Like I'm actually feeling less stressed. And it's just 15 minutes. So I kind of feel silly that it took me this long to recognize that, but it's been working for me. So I'm really excited about that.
Those 15 minutes can make a big difference. But I have a question. Are you adjusting anything on the back end? Like, are you going to bed 15 minutes earlier, or is it just about not hitting that snooze button?
It's more about not hitting that snooze button. I go to bed fairly early and I'm pretty intuitive. Like if I'm tired, I'm going to go to sleep. But I think
Wait,
in the
what's
morning,
early?
like I go to bed like 9:30, 10 o'clock. So yeah, so early. I need later than that, and I am like a overtired toddler. So like I am very aware of that. So I'm not going to bed any earlier, but it's the idea of like if I wake up at 6:15 instead of 6, I have 15 less minutes in my morning. And while 15 minutes of sleep sounds wonderful, I know that what ended up happening and what was happening is I was waking up at 6 and then just thinking, oh my gosh, I have all these things to do. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And then, then 6:15 comes along, right? And then it's like a wasted time. So instead, I'm intentional about it. I'm just going to wake up. And I find that that's a lot of my self-care is that I spend so much time being like, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. Or like, I know I really should be doing this, but I'm feeling so tired. And if I spend that time instead just doing the thing I actually wanted to do, that's not wasted time anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that is my mantra, like small things and not wasting my time.
I love that. I heard this once. I might have shared this on this podcast, but if you snooze your alarm in the morning, that you are breaking the first promise to yourself in the day by not, waking up when you said you would. And that like has stuck with me. It's such a powerful idea.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
You're keeping
I've
the
been
promise
keeping
to yourself, Arielle.
I love that. I love that. And I am going to tell my husband that. Just
Catherine,
kidding.
what
No
about,
shame.
yeah, no shame, no shame. Yeah. Snoozing is fine. Catherine, how about you? How are you this week? What is your self-care looking like?
I'm feeling pretty good. And part of that is because I know that I talk about how a lot of the times I'll separate my self-care and that'll be time to myself versus like trying to just incorporate it into my life now as a new mom. So my self-care a lot this week has really been doing it simultaneously while I'm mom. So like to be more specific, that is that has been listening to podcasts that I really want to listen to while driving. So like sometimes I'll be driving and my daughter's in the back seat and I'll just like play music. I'm not at the level where I'm playing like kiddie music. We're not doing that yet. We're playing good.
Good.
We're playing good songs. Sometimes it's songs that like my husband and I have like a good playlist and we'll play that for her to go to sleep to and she'll fall asleep in the car. But what I'm getting at here is that some of the time in the car now I'm spending for me because like she's just zoning out, like talking and talking in air quotes, looking out the window or like playing with a little toy. And she doesn't need me to just be engaging with her all of that time. So I've been putting on podcasts while I've been driving and they've been really fun. Like, don't get me wrong, I am like in love with health and wellness podcasts. I listen to them for fun, and then it's cool that it weaves into what we do here. But I've just also been listening to like some like whatever podcasts, and that's been really fun to just like kick back and listen to these people chat about nonsense. Like, great, cool.
Like what? What are you listening to?
The new one that I've been listening to is The Skinny Confidential.
It's come up in my like recommended for you.
It's really good. And actually, they do talk about health and wellness sometimes, but then other times it's just like right now, the one that I'm listening to is literally, Amy, you might want to listen to this one. It's about The Bachelor. They have Chris Harrison on and his wife and talk about like all the like behind the scenes stuff that's going on in The Bachelor. So really nonsense. Great. I love it.
Amazing.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you. So as I do that, how about you, Amy? What are you doing? How are you feeling?
This has been a really rough week. It's the week before I go on vacation, which is always a busy week, just trying to get everything in, but it's just like been amplified by just, the realities of, working in a mental health field and owning a business. So like I've spent every day this week with one exception, in meetings like back to back, like literally 11 hours straight with no break. And that's been exhausting. And so I like have been so diligent about getting my workouts in every day. It's like a non-negotiable. Like I need this. If I only get 1 hour to myself this week, I'm taking it. And it almost feels like a little bit rebellious in a sense to say like, nope, this is my time. I'm taking it back at whatever cost it comes to me, whether that's maybe a little bit less sleep or like this morning I asked to push back a meeting like for 5 minutes so I can do this to my hair. But like, so getting my body moving in a way that feels really good to me has been the main self-care this week. Cause it feels like that's all I can do. And so I'm just going to like go all in on what I can do this week. So that's where I'm at.
Wow.
And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can see this fantastic hair style that I'm sporting.
I like it. You rock the high pony. It's always working for you. So
Yeah, I
Thanks.
love it.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that this is kind of a continuation from a recent self-care that you talked about, that you're squeezing you in. No matter what it takes, you're doing it. And that I think I said this last time too. Like I know how hard that is for you. And it's amazing that you're doing it.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's what we're all doing, right?
Mhm.
It's so interesting that all of our self-cares was like about like figuring out how to self-care and be, right? It's not an event. It's not a self-care event. It's not going to the spa or taking hours off, right? Like it's figuring out how to take care of yourself while you're also being, working and not being a mom or running a business. It's all of that. So I think that was really interesting that we all kind of went there this week.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and also, Amy, you are about to have one of those dessert self-cares. You're going on vacation, and
Mhm.
typically that can be a week where self-care is totally out the window because you can justify it by saying, hey, I'm about to get all this self-care, like a whole week of self-care, like yay me. So let me just like bury myself here. It's fine.
Yes.
It's just like, no, I've been there. And then those are the times where I go on vacation, and it takes me that entire week to actually get into the vacation mode. And you're seasoned now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, you know me or something,
I
Catherine.
do.
Like, but no, that's such a good point. Yeah. I don't want to rob myself of this like vacation by like, by being burnt out by the time I get there. So yes, good call out. So thank you. Okay. Well, I appreciate us all checking in, and Arielle, for you like noticing that overlap. It just speaks to like how like insightful and aware Arielle is, and what a pleasure it is to have her on our team and have her working with us. So
I just want to take a quick pause to tell you that Revive is hiring. In our Miami and Pittsburgh offices, we have full and part-time W-2 and 1099 clinician positions available, and this includes both postgraduate and associate level licenses, in addition to fully licensed clinicians. In our Connecticut offices, we have full-time, fully licensed W-2 clinician positions available, including clinical supervisor opportunities. If you are interested in working for a company that values community, work-life balance, and your personal and professional growth, then we want to meet you. Find a link to our website in our bio.
Let's shift into our main topic today in talking about trauma. And before we do that, though, Arielle, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself more fully to our audience and share a little bit about you and your background and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am, fairly new to Revive, but I'm not new to the mental health world or, to being a social worker or a therapist. So I am, as I said, a licensed clinical social worker. My frame really comes from, a person and an environment. And my work before coming to Revive has really been, I've had a wide range of experiences, but it started off really trauma based. So I worked in foster care and moved to domestic violence and sexual assault. And that's really where I understood and saw the effect of trauma that has on individuals, and also this appreciation almost for trauma and how it affects others. And so I decided to get a postgraduate certificate in trauma therapy and integrative trauma therapy, because I realized just how much trauma affects everyone. And we'll get into really like what trauma is, because I think there's a big misconception of what it is. And so through that postgraduate program, I really understood how trauma affects the individual, how it can come into the room, and how as a therapist we can support those who have gone through trauma. And through there, I was actually trained in EMDR, which is, I know, the second part of what we're going to talk about, which is a trauma therapy. And after that, a few years later, I was trained in sensorimotor psychotherapy, which is another form of trauma therapy. And what I love just about the work that I do and the work that I've done and learning these different modalities is that they really can be used for so many different things, and they can be applicable to so many different things. And that really the idea is that, when we feel stuck, we probably feel stuck because something's going on. Our bodies are telling us something. And I find that the trauma work really gets to that stuckness. And so I've seen some like really amazing things happen when you recognize your trauma, you accept your trauma, and are willing to work through it.
Wow. You've really gone through the trauma training ringer here. You found your calling, it sounds like.
I hope, yeah. I mean, I have a passion for trauma and for those who survive trauma, and who are bold enough to talk about it.
And we're talking about trauma, around trauma, but can you define what that is? I feel like there's a definition of trauma, but then there's also the way that you might view trauma.
Yeah, right. So I think also when we talk about like the definition of trauma, it's evolved so much. And without going into a big diatribe on the history of trauma, I think it's really important to recognize that this has been this field of study, and this field, especially of like mental health, is really actually new. So before like the Vietnam War, to be honest, like trauma was a military thing, was a like shell shock. It was, you had trauma if you were in the trenches, right? That's like where that came from. Before that, it was hysteria. You know, women who went through trauma growing up, it was hysteria. Oh, that's what that was, right? So trauma is new in its study, and I think because of that, there's a lot of misconceptions of what trauma is, and so just understanding that I think is really important. That I think it's changed as we started to understand it more. And really, honestly, what it is that it is a perceived or real threat of danger or violence or death. And I think the most important part of that is a perceived, that you don't have to be, you know, in a car accident or have this major thing happen to experience trauma. It is really this understanding or perception that your life or something, or yeah, your life or your liveliness is at stake. Um, and so when we look at trauma, really, we also have to separate trauma, like a traumatic event, from PTSD and from the traumatic effects and traumatic responses, too, because some of us, and I may be jumping ahead, so you could slow me down. A lot of, we could go through a trauma and not be traumatized after. And really what determines that, there's a couple of things, but one of the main things that determines that is the control that we feel, or that we feel that we have during the traumatic event. So it's super interesting. There's a lot that goes into it, but anything in which we feel unsafe, an event where we feel unsafe, whether it be physically, mentally, emotionally, like that can be trauma.
You're talking about there's more of a broader scope of what trauma can be. And so I'm wondering, like, if there still like a standard of like somebody calling something that happened to them trauma that potentially isn't actually trauma, and kind of like reframing that for them almost in a positive way, that for them that could actually benefit them to not actually think of it in this more intense sort of scenario.
Maybe this is where you're going with this, Catherine, and maybe this is perhaps taking us too far down a different path. But I think one of the things I'm thinking about when you're asking that, Catherine, is like in my own work or even on social media, the way in which the word trauma is used right now feels like so overused, where it almost feels like it waters down with the meaning of trauma or the experience of trauma, where I have clients, or just people in my life talk about a stressful event that happened, like their boss, gave them a poor performance review, and they're saying like, I'm now traumatized from that. And so is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, maybe I definitely, I think I didn't phrase it correctly, because I think like, one, I want to just address the fact that I think that it's really helpful now that it seems like people are looking to other events that could have caused actual trauma for people, other than literally one thing. Like, people are looking at war and just saying like, oh, well, that's trauma and nothing else. So I think it's really great now that that there's been a shift in kind of accepting these other serious and life-shattering, life-changing events, and pointing that to like, oh, that was traumatic. And to what you're saying, Amy, I think like then it also has gotten like really fuzzy in the media of people claiming certain things as trauma that then end up minimizing other people's, for lack of a better term, like real trauma, in air quotes. So like, how do you differentiate that, or how do you like kind of piece that out?
Or is it important to, I guess?
Yeah.
I think, Amy, that's kind of where I'm at, is that, I when I have a client bring something to me, I have to recognize that when they're bringing to me is their experience, and there's some attachment to that, right? So someone could say, this was traumatic to me, and I could feel like, what is it? But that's what they're experiencing. I think that there is, the definition of trauma, and I think that there is a difference. Like, I will very quickly read you a Bessel van der Kolk, who he's probably like one of the more famous people when we talk about trauma out there, but he said the critical difference between a stressful but normal event and trauma is the feeling of helplessness to change the outcome. As long as people can imagine having some control of what is happening to them, they can usually keep their wits about them. So I think like that's something that I also bring to clients too. Like this could be hard, but you had control in that situation. Whereas in yes, so
Well, I
whereas
think
yeah,
that
go
that
ahead.
seems like such a key point and I like that you said that you're taking what your clients are saying, and you're not saying like, well, that wasn't trauma. Like you're trying to look at it from the framework of something being hard, something being stressful, and trying to sort of like work with them and try to understand their experience better without
Yeah.
actually just like blanketing the whole experience with this idea of something being traumatic. And I think that's important because as therapists, we need to challenge our clients. We can't just take what they say and just like as fact almost, and then use that with them, because then we're not actually like working with them. We're just kind of like validating them and then not really getting them anywhere else.
Yeah. And and I think that it's again, I think it's important to I reflect language back, but then I think psychoeducation is such an important part of trauma work because there's so it's just important to know what's going on. And I think another thing that I found super fascinating was this control aspect of trauma and traumatic events. Someone that I learned from gave the example of if two people are in a car accident, right? There's the driver and the passenger, they could have two very different reactions and they don't both have to be traumatized and from it, right? And typically actually what ends up happening is we find that the person driving tends to at times have less PTSD symptoms or feel traumatized from the event than the person in the passenger seat because the driver had a perceived sense of control whereas the passenger had no sense of control, right? So I think that is super interesting, and I think that's a really great way to frame it too, right? If you feel like you have no control in a situation, it's going to feel worse. If you feel like you have control in a situation, your body's doing what it needs to do to protect itself. You braced when it happened. That's probably why you have whiplash. Like all of that, like is your body's sense of control. And so I think something that I know my clients have found empowering in the past is that you could go through something that could be labeled as traumatic and not then feel trauma afterwards. You don't have to feel trauma afterwards. You can label it as like, this was a bad event, this was traumatic, and this was a trauma event, but it wasn't traumatic to me.
In our work, we hear like, especially as we go through our trainings and stuff, and maybe it's also a helpful framework to bring with clients, we hear this distinction between big T and little t traumas. Can you talk about that? Do you think that still feels relevant given this more broad definition of trauma or view of trauma?
I think it's really it's contextual. It depends on the situation. I've found before explaining the difference between big T and little t, and just for our listeners who don't know the difference, big T is usually the like car accident or fire or sudden sudden big thing happening, whereas little t trauma is usually more of a subtle trauma, maybe a more emotional trauma, something like that. And what I find is that like usually that people who've gone through the big T trauma like know that it's trauma, and I find that those who maybe gone through the little t, and I'm using air quotes, don't it's almost not socially acceptable for it to be a trauma. And so being able to label it that way has been really helpful and explain it. But when I talk about trauma with my clients, I actually don't use big T and little t trauma because ultimately, like, even labeling it is saying like, if you have the big T trauma, that's acceptable. Little t is small, it's not that big. When a smaller T trauma can feel just as impactful as a big T trauma. And so yeah, I think again, psychoeducation wise, sometimes it's helpful, but I find that labeling it can almost make it feel as if it's not as important.
Not as invalid, not as validating.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense or knowledge around why it is that some people might be more quote unquote like sensitive to like experience traumatic stress symptoms than others, like beyond like feeling more in control versus not? Like is there anything about you know, family history or temperament or any of that that might also impact things?
Yes, actually, very much so. So attachment and the way and your attachment pattern actually has a lot to do with the outcome of trauma. So it's the perceived control that you have during a traumatic event, but it's also your attachment pattern really has a lot to do with it as well. So we find that maybe those who have more of an insecure attachment or or something of the sort that also can lead to more PTSD symptoms or feeling a trauma more. But yeah, I think I yes to that's to kind of that's to answer your question. Yes.
Go ahead, Catherine. It looks like you're gonna.
No, I was just gonna say that's so interesting, and I didn't know that, and I think that's, yeah, like it's so interesting that something that you also don't have control over can affect whether or not you feel the effects of a traumatic event.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because if you think about it too, right? Why something is traumatic is because you don't feel safe. So if you can't locate feeling safe before something happens, and that this idea of feeling safe and feeling grounded is something that is difficult for you in general, it's going to be harder to work through a trauma because you don't even know what that safe feeling feels like.
I know that we're sort of moving away from big T and little T traumas, but like those events are what we might refer to as more acute events, like kind of moments in time. But what about more complex trauma? Can you just describe what that looks like, and how that might or might not be different from the experience of a more kind of acute incident, traumatic event?
Yeah, so I like to label it, and I know others do too, as like single incident trauma and complex trauma. Like single incident trauma is usually a trauma that happens once. It's kind of not, it's out of the ordinary, right? It's an out of the ordinary event that happens, right? And it's a singular event usually. And if that's not to say that there may be other separate individual events too. But what complex trauma is and it usually happens. We usually define complex trauma and identify it as happening in childhood. But it is a series of events in which you feel this lack of control. It usually, like, for example, a complex trauma, when we talk about complex trauma, we usually talk about child abuse and neglect that happened throughout a span of childhood. That wasn't just one thing that happened, right? It just wasn't one incident of violence. It was growing up in a home that never felt safe or secure, or a home that felt chaotic, right? That's more of when we talk about complex trauma. And it's usually very attachment based, right? So complex and attachment trauma are very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Do you approach the treatment of acute trauma differently than you would complex trauma?
So I think it depends on the therapist, and I think it depends on where someone is also in their trauma journey. I will say, and this we'll be talking about later. Like, there's different modalities that probably work better in different ways. Um, I I have found in my own experience, and I want to talk very much within my own experience as a clinician, that EMDR has it, I don't want to say it's more effective because I don't believe it's more effective with single incident trauma, but it tends to be a little bit quicker of a treatment with single incident trauma, because you have one event, you're going through one event, as opposed to complex trauma. There's a lot. It's complex, right? There's a lot of layers to it. So I think that there could be a difference of approach there, and maybe a different structure to how therapy looks. Um, and yeah, and there's a lot more attachment stuff again with when we talk about complex trauma. So that's a long-winded way of saying it depends on the clinician and it depends on the trauma, and it but then it can look different and sometimes does look different.
Mhm. And I'll just add in too. One of the trauma treatments that I'm trained in is in trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which again, like similar to what you're describing with EMDR, is that it feels a lot, for lack of a better word, simpler to apply that methodology when there is one distinct event or one single incident trauma. Because what I found clients say as we're trying to potentially identify a specific narrative that they might want to focus on, it's like, well, how do I pick which one? Where do I start? And how do we from that framework work on this experience when I'm still very much part of the environment that has contributed to the way that I am feeling and experiencing what has happened or what is happening.
Yeah. I think you bring up a really good point, Amy, too, is this idea of still being in the environment that is unsafe. And the tricky thing about trauma therapy is that the goal of trauma therapy is to get your body feeling safe, right? Because what trauma is this, or PTSD, or is this feeling of being unsafe when you are safe, right? The whole goal is to create this safe feeling in your body, this grounded feeling in your body. If you are in an environment that is still unsafe, you can't get there, and so you may not be able to go through the trauma treatment because you're not in a place where you don't need to be in fight, flight, and freeze. So your therapy may look different. It may just be about how do you ground yourself, how do you create a safe enough place, as opposed to, okay, let's go process the trauma, because you can't process something that you're still going through. Um, and so I think that that's a really tricky and important, but an important aspect of
Mhm.
this.
Mhm. Right. And perhaps this will come up in our part two, but I think there is such a big misconception about what quote unquote trauma work is. And it's kind of a dialogue that I get into a lot with my clients in sort of like what they expect it to look like, or what it's supposed to look like, or what is actually helpful, and how to get relief from all of this stuff. And so again, perhaps conversation for part two of our episode, but yeah, trauma treatment in general feels like a very complicated just thing to even begin to consider, on top of just trauma being so complex and layered to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've had a lot of times clients come in and be like, I don't want to feel this anymore. So will this mean that I won't feel this anymore? That, like, I look back at my trauma and it won't feel traumatic? And I'm like, I wish, right? I wish I could take a magical wand and make it so that you could look back on your trauma and be like, that's in the past, right? But that's not realistic, because
Hmm.
what you went through was really difficult.
Hmm.
But so our goal of trauma therapy is not to eradicate the unpleasant feelings. The goal of trauma therapy is to regulate your body, and to be able to regulate your nervous system, and to be able to have your thoughts and your feelings, your body feelings, align in this. I am safe. I am no longer in this trauma. I no longer have to be in fight, freeze mode. I can trust others, right? And not, I I am no longer thinking that what happened to me was bad, right? So and I think that that's an important aspect to it, is that I can't eradicate the trauma. I can't tell you that you'll forget about it and you'll never think about it, because that's unrealistic. But what we can do is we can create a space and inside of you in which you feel safe and grounded, and you know that you are safe and you're no longer having to experience what you experience.
Hmm. Right. And TFCBT has a similar goal, right? Like that someone's body's ability to digest stress is a little bit more comfortable, but the stress will be there. And it's again their association and ability to kind of sit with and tolerate the stress might shift and change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes trauma therapy is just about um create like labeling, like, this window of tolerance, right? We talk a lot, if you've been in therapy or you've maybe heard this before, this idea of a window of tolerance, and it's within this frame of how of being able to handle stressors, right? And sometimes, and our window of tolerance changes. It can be changed daily. It could change throughout our lives. Sometimes it's really small. Like if I am really tired and I, haven't been taking care of myself, my window of tolerance can be tiny. And what that means is that um, something small can set me out of out of me being able to manage my emotions in a way where I am present, where my prefrontal cortex is on, right? When you are out of your window of tolerance, your prefrontal cortex, which is like your reasoning part of your brain, shuts off, and we go into this like reptilian fight, flight, freeze mode. And so, what trauma therapy, the goal of trauma therapy is keeping the person within their window of tolerance, but also lengthening their window of tolerance so that there's more things that you could tolerate without jumping into the fight, flight, freeze mode. So sometimes like that is enough. Like if it's just about tolerating your emotions, tolerating your body sensations, tolerating, what's going on, even just a little bit more, you're doing the work.
You mentioned before how people can have unpleasant feelings around their trauma. Can you talk about what that looks like and also talk a little bit more about some other symptoms that come along with PTSD or having experienced a trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we haven't really talked about that. So I'm glad that we are. Because I think it ranges, right? Sometimes we're not aware that we are reacting out of a trauma response, and it's just kind of how we've, functioned and as a survival, But a lot of times, and so the symptoms that I will list are not necessarily if you have these symptoms, it doesn't mean that you have PTSD or you've experienced trauma. Sometimes they can. I think that's also something else that I want to note is that a lot of times symptoms of PTSD tend to resemble other diagnoses. And so sometimes it could get tricky differentiating between that. So, when we talk about PTSD symptoms, sometimes we talk about irritability. Sometimes we talk about libel mood, which is, going from highs to lows. We talk about anxiety and panic symptoms. We talk about dissociation. A lot of times when someone is experiencing trauma, they dissociate, which means they are unable to remain present, and that can look like so many different things, whether it's like active flashbacks or just not being able to be connected to your emotions, or not being able, or having panic or shaking or freezing or things like this. So there's a lot of symptoms that can represent different things, but it is a culmination of these symptoms, and also having gone through a traumatic event that you can identify as PTSD. But I
So it's
think,
sort of like the start of having those symptoms.
yeah. So the onset is going through a traumatic event, right? And so that's the important aspect of it.
Well, and I think just sorry, one thing to add to it too, Arielle, is I think the other piece of it too with diagnostically, that there's a time frame, and it's that
Yeah.
these symptoms are still present 6 months after the event. And I think that's such an important distinction because like if any of us have gone through something that is a traumatic, it would be reasonable, right, for us to have and healthy even, for us to have some of these symptoms after we've gone through something like very scary and very stressful. And so like to what Arielle is just describing, if these symptoms persist for a duration beyond that period, then that's where we're really thinking like this trauma has really been maybe a little bit more internalized or has really impacted someone's ability to function in a way that they weren't before.
100%, absolutely, right? Because like Amy said, there are reasonable responses to trauma. We all kind of go through it, and I think also something that's important about trauma is that it's sometimes we have to go through the trauma, and then it's not automatic, right? It's not like we automatically have these symptoms, and that's why the 6 months is really important, because sometimes we could go through a trauma and still feel like we are in this fight, freeze, with still be, for lack of a better word, in shock, or and then so those are when those symptoms kind of come up, and then we experience them afterwards. I know even what we're seeing in general, and this is maybe steering off topic, so feel free to steer me back, but COVID-19 is looked at as a traumatic event for a lot of people. And if we think about it, if we think about what the definition of trauma is this perceived threat to someone's health or liveliness and this lack of control. And that was what a lot of us felt during COVID-19 and some more than others. And again, then we can get into the technicalities of it. But while we were going through it, we were in survival mode. We weren't thinking about it. But what we are seeing as mental health clinicians is now in this after space of COVID-19, even though obviously it's still here, but this like after lockdown, we're seeing the responses of COVID. We're seeing the hypervigilance. We're seeing the anxiety. We're seeing the unable to manage these emotions and right after COVID or during COVID, it made sense, right? Now that we're in a more safe place, if this is persisting, like this is when we should start questioning, like, what am I going through? Is this normal? Is this something more than just like reaction to a trauma?
Great point.
Mhm.
Okay, so this was a very light, kind of like almost Spark Notes version of what trauma is, because I think that we could even expand on that and expand on just the experience of trauma in part 2, part 3, part 4. But for the sake of this, we'll kind of wrap up here with the basics of what is trauma. And we did dip our toes a little bit into the treatment of trauma that we'll get a lot more into in part 2 with Arielle in our next episode.
Mhm. Yes. And as Catherine was just saying, and we alluded to at the top, this is the first of what can be 1,000 conversations. And so if you have any questions about trauma, whether it's related to anything that we talked about today that you'd like to hear a little bit more about, or just in general, some of the things that you've seen or read about that you just want to understand a little bit more, you can email us at wishingyouwell@revivecfw.com, and we can have Arielle back for, part however many we need in order to get us to a fuller understanding and conversation of trauma. So we're here for it. Let us know what else you might want to know about. But as Catherine already said, we'll be back with a part 2 about trauma treatment. So stay tuned for that. You can continue to follow along with us here on our Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Make sure you're rating, reviewing, subscribing, sharing with a friend. You can also follow us on Instagram at ReviveCFW. You can follow me at Amy Albero, LCSW, Catherine at Catherine Van Eyck. And again, send us those emails to wishingyouwell@revivecfw.com. Until next time, we are wishing you well.